The air smelled of fresh pine and damp earth. The scent of an old forest that had stood long before the neighborhood sprawled around it. Towering oak and sycamore trees framed the property, their thick branches forming a natural canopy that filtered the golden morning light. Birds nested high in the boughs, filling the air with a symphony of chirps and rustling leaves. It was a peaceful place, a home built not just for shelter but for harmony with the land. James Turner leaned against his porch railing, sipping coffee from a weathered mug. The house had been in his family for generations, a sturdy cabin-style home built on the outskirts of an affluent neighborhood that had sprouted over the years. His grandfather had fought to preserve the land, ensuring the towering trees remained untouched. He had told James, "These trees will outlive all of us. They're a part of history, protected by law and by nature itself." But lately, James had felt an encroaching pressure, like a storm forming just beyond the horizon. The Homeowners Association, HOA for short, had never taken kindly to his presence. He wasn't a typical resident. He didn't obsess over manicured lawns, uniform mailboxes, or the rigid aesthetics that the HOA seemed to worship like scripture. His property was different, organic, natural, and undeniably beautiful in its own right. But to them, it was an eyesore. At the center of the HOA's relentless scrutiny was Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. With an iron grip on every regulation and a network of eager rule followers at her disposal, Karen had made it her personal mission to improve the area, which, in her mind, meant erasing anything that didn't fit her pristine vision. James had dealt with minor infractions before, a warning about his fence being too rustic, complaints about his natural garden being unkempt. But those were nuisances, not outright threats. This time, however, something felt different. The tension had started subtly. A few passive-aggressive comments from neighbors, murmurs about enhancing property values by opening up the view. He caught Karen glancing at his trees too often, eyes narrowed with calculation. And then, last week, a notice had appeared in his mailbox. "Your trees obstruct the view for neighboring properties. Please consider trimming or removing them to comply with neighborhood beautification standards." James had scoffed at the audacity. The trees weren't just his. They were legally protected under federal conservation laws. Removing them wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. He had written a firm but polite response, citing the law and assuming that would be the end of it. He was wrong. Character's inner struggle. James had never been one for confrontation. He had inherited his grandfather's quiet resilience, the kind that believed in standing firm, but without unnecessary conflict. But Karen was different. She didn't back down. She didn't ask, she demanded. And now, something gnawed at the back of his mind, a feeling he couldn't shake. He hadn't seen or heard from Karen in days, but something was off. The birds outside were quieter than usual. The morning air carried a stillness that unsettled him. As he stepped off the porch, his boots crunching against the gravel path leading to his backyard, a tightness formed in his chest. Then he saw it. His heart stopped. The ground where his beloved trees once stood was scarred, the deep gashes in the earth evidence of chainsaws and heavy machinery. Piles of fresh sawdust lay where ancient trunks had once been rooted. There remains now nothing but logs stacked neatly by the curb, like a trophy. James felt a sharp inhale, but his body refused to exhale. Karen had done this. She had taken what wasn't hers to take. A slow, burning rage built inside him, its embers fueled by disbelief and a deep, gnawing sense of loss. His fists clenched, the nails digging into his palms. He could already hear her excuses, the condescending tone she would use when he confronted her. "Oh, it was just a few trees, James. Think about how much better the neighborhood looks now. Everyone will have such a lovely view." As if his land, his history, his rights meant nothing. He took a shuddering breath, forcing his thoughts into order. This wasn't just about the trees. This was about principle, about justice, about the law she had so brazenly ignored. James wasn't the type to pick fights, but Karen had just made one unavoidable, and she had no idea what she had just done. Karen Whitmore believed in perfection, at least her definition of it. To her, the neighborhood wasn't just a place to live. It was a canvas, and she saw herself as the artist shaping it to her vision. With her impeccable blonde bob, pastel power suits, and a sharp, ever-watchful gaze, she ruled the HOA with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. Every front yard, every fence height, every exterior paint color had to conform to the pristine, magazine cover aesthetic she demanded. Anything outside of that vision was a problem she intended to correct. She lived in the grandest house on the street, an over-manicured, two-story colonial with symmetrical rose bushes and a white picket fence so polished it looked unnatural. From the oversized bay windows of her living room, she had a commanding view of the entire neighborhood, except for one thing: the towering trees in James Turner's backyard. They blocked her perfect sunset view, something she had mentioned in passing at every HOA meeting for the last 6 months. "James, surely you understand," she had said with that carefully rehearsed smile. "Those trees, they're just so overwhelming. They don't match the rest of the neighborhood's aesthetic." James had ignored her complaints, but Karen was not the type to accept resistance. She had worked too hard, built too much influence, to let a stubborn holdout defy her wishes. And when she had received his curt response citing legal protections for the trees, she had merely pursed her lips and muttered, "We'll see about that." The next morning, the trees were gone. And now, as James stood before the destruction, Karen made her grand entrance. Initial conflict scene. James was still staring at the remains of his trees, his breath slow and measured, when he heard the unmistakable click of expensive heels on pavement. The sound was deliberate, each step carrying an air of self-importance. He turned to see Karen approaching, a self-satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her lips. "James," she said, tilting her head slightly, as though feigning concern. "Oh dear, I see you've noticed the improvements." His jaw tightened. "You cut down my trees." His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Karen let out a light, dismissive laugh. "Well, I wouldn't say I did it, Peresi. The HOA board and I simply decided that the trees were becoming a bit of an eyesore. And, let's be honest, they were bringing down property values. This way, the whole street gets to enjoy a much better view. Isn't that nice?" James clenched his fists at his sides, willing himself to stay composed. Those trees were protected by federal law. Karen's smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew. "Oh, James, let's not get dramatic. These laws, they're open to interpretation. And besides, what's done is done. The neighborhood is better for it." She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. "Honestly, James, you should be thanking me. Your property looks much more presentable now. If you ever decide to sell, this will help tremendously." James exhaled slowly, keeping his emotions in check. "You had no right." Karen sighed as if dealing with a petulant child. "The HOA has rights, James. And I do have a say in what happens here. It's in the best interest of the community." He could feel his pulse hammering in his ears, but he refused to give her the satisfaction of an outburst. Instead, he met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "You think you can just bulldoze over people and get away with it?" Karen arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "I don't think I can, James. I know I can." With that, she turned on her heel and strode away, leaving James standing in the wreckage of what once was his. Building empathy. James stood still long after she had gone, his breath coming in slow, measured waves. He knew what she wanted, to see him break, to see him lash out so she could spin the story in her favor. He wouldn't give her that. He wouldn't let her win. Instead, he knelt down and ran his fingers through the fresh sawdust, the remnants of something irreplaceable. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. "These trees will outlive all of us." Except they hadn't. Not anymore. A lump formed in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He had to think. He had to be smart. Anger alone wouldn't fix this. And if Karen thought he would roll over and accept defeat, she was sorely mistaken. He rose to his feet, his mind already racing through possibilities. There was something Karen didn't know, something she had overlooked in her arrogance. She thought she held all the power, but she had just made a mistake. And James was about to make sure she regretted it. James wasn't just an ordinary homeowner, but Karen hadn't bothered to find that out. While he lived simply, preferring the quiet of his wooded backyard to the HOA's manicured expectations, there was more to him than met the eye. He had spent years working in environmental law, specializing in conservation efforts. He knew the ins and outs of land protection statutes better than most government officials. He had written reports, testified in hearings, and helped draft legal frameworks that safeguarded ancient trees like the ones Karen had just destroyed. And Karen? She had no idea. James didn't flaunt his knowledge, nor did he wear his credentials like a badge of honor. He had chosen to step away from the legal battlefield, to live in peace in the home his grandfather built. But peace had been shattered. Now, he had a reason to fight again. As he sifted through the remains of his trees, he noticed something. A few of the tree stumps bore markings. Protected species. Federally recognized. The very thing that would make Karen's little beautification project not just unethical, but illegal. His fingers brushed over the rough edges, his mind already working through the strategy. Karen had taken something from him. She had no idea what he was about to take from her. Escalating encounters. 1. The HOA reminder. 2 days after the confrontation, James received an official letter from the HOA. The envelope was crisp, sealed with an embossed logo. The contents? Dear Mr. Turner, as you know, our HOA guidelines prioritize the aesthetic and financial value of the neighborhood. While we understand your recent concerns, please be advised that all residents must comply with further neighborhood improvements. Given your unique property layout, we strongly recommend updating your fencing and exterior to align with the neighborhood's uniform standards. Failure to comply may result in fines or additional HOA action. James read the letter twice. Karen wasn't just done with him. She was escalating. He folded the letter neatly, set it aside, and smirked. She was digging her own grave. 2. The unannounced visit. That weekend, James was in his backyard, surveying the damage, when he heard it. The sound of tires crunching over gravel. Karen. She stepped out of her pristine white luxury SUV, her heels clicking against his driveway. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 HOA board members followed her, one holding a clipboard, the other adjusting his glasses nervously. Karen's smile was all polished condescension. James, she greeted, voice honeyed but sharp. I thought I'd drop by to discuss some improvements. You know, since the trees are out of the way, we have a perfect opportunity to modernize your property's aesthetic. James tilted his head, unfazed. You mean bulldoze more of my land? Karen tittered, waving a manicured hand. Oh, don't be so dramatic. We're simply enforcing the rules. Rules that everyone here must follow. James crossed his arms. Like how you followed federal law when you had those trees cut down. A flicker of something crossed Karen's face. Irritation, maybe. James, I assure you, the HOA acted within its rights. If you have concerns, you're always welcome to bring them up at the next meeting. Oh, I will, he said, his tone even. And I'll be bringing a few others into the conversation as well. Karen's lips thinned. She glanced at her clipboard-wielding board member. Well, regardless, we need to address the matter of your fencing. It's looking quite aged. You have 30 days to update it, or the HOA will handle it for you, at your expense. James let out a slow breath, giving nothing away. Karen thought she was tightening her grip. She had no idea what was coming. Cliffhangers. 1. A silent warning. That night, James made a phone call. A few, actually. He didn't just know environmental law. He knew the right people. People who had been waiting for a case like this. The next morning, Karen found something on her doorstep. A thick envelope, marked with an official government seal. A cease and desist order. A formal notice of investigation into illegal destruction of protected trees. But the best part? It was just the beginning. 2. A meeting of consequences. At the next HOA meeting, James arrived early. Karen had expected him to be silent, to slink into the background while she took center stage. Instead, he took a seat at the front. Calm, collected. Karen barely glanced at him as she called the meeting to order. She launched into her usual agenda. Neighborhood improvements, compliance issues, the need for further beautification efforts. And then, before we move on, James said smoothly, I have a matter to discuss. Karen's smile faltered. Oh. James reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. He set it down with deliberate ease. I'd like to formally submit evidence that several trees removed from my property were federally protected species. He let the words sink in before continuing. And I'd like to discuss the legal ramifications of unauthorized destruction of conservation land. A hush fell over the room. Karen's face went pale. James leaned back in his chair, watching her reaction with measured patience. She had pushed. Now it was his turn. James had spent the past few weeks carefully gathering his case against Karen and the HOA. Every late night spent reviewing legal statutes, every meeting with environmental law specialists, and every careful interaction with neighbors was a calculated step forward. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was preparing to dismantle the unchecked power Karen had wielded over the community for years. But tonight, he needed a break. He sat at the edge of a long conference table in a dimly lit office, tapping his fingers against a thick legal binder. Across from him sat his old friend and former law school colleague, Daniel Reeves, one of the best environmental lawyers in the state. You know, Daniel mused, flipping through James's documents, when you left law behind, I thought you'd never look back. But this. He tapped the folder. This is airtight. You haven't lost your touch. James chuckled, shaking his head. Didn't think I'd ever need it again, but here we are. Daniel smirked. So, this Karen lady, she has no idea who she's up against, does she? None, James said, exhaling. And I plan to keep it that way, until it's too late for her to do anything about it. Daniel nodded. Smart. The moment she realizes she's not dealing with just another homeowner, she'll try to cover her tracks. He leaned forward. When's the next HOA meeting? 2 days from now, James replied. Daniel grinned. Then 2 days from now, she learns the hard way. Resilience under pressure. Karen wasn't backing down. Since the last HOA meeting, she had doubled her efforts to make James's life miserable. First, she had the HOA send yet another citation, this time claiming that the removal of the trees had left his yard in an unacceptable state of disrepair, despite the fact that she had ordered them to be cut down in the first place. Then, she orchestrated a neighborhood-wide petition demanding James comply with community beautification standards, effectively blaming him for the damage she had caused. And as a final blow, she had an anonymous tip sent to the city zoning department, prompting an inspection of his property for supposed violations. But James didn't budge. He calmly addressed each citation with counterclaims, each petition with legal rebuttals, and each city inquiry with documentation proving that the only violation that had taken place was Karen's. And he did it all with unwavering patience. Neighbors began to notice. Some, who had always feared stepping out of line under Karen's rule, started whispering about James's resilience. Others, emboldened by his refusal to back down, started questioning the HOA's authority. Karen could feel the control slipping through her fingers. She tried to press harder, calling an emergency board meeting to discuss ongoing community concerns. James received the notice the night before, but instead of panic, a small smile played at his lips. She was desperate. She could feel something shifting, and she was right. Building audience expectation. The morning of the emergency HOA meeting, James received an official letter from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He opened it slowly, scanning the contents. Then, for the first time since this battle began, he let out a deep, satisfied breath. Karen had no idea what was coming. As he stepped out onto his porch, he noticed a small gathering of neighbors standing outside, murmuring amongst themselves. One of them, an older man named Greg, approached him hesitantly. James, Greg said, rubbing the back of his neck. A few of us were wondering, what's going to happen at the meeting tonight? James considered his words carefully. Then, he offered a reassuring nod. Let's just say things are about to change. Greg studied him, then gave a small chuckle. Never thought I'd see someone stand up to Karen and actually win. James smiled. You will tonight. As he walked back inside, the anticipation in the air was undeniable. The storm had been building for weeks. Tonight, it would break. The HOA meeting was packed. The usual sterile conference room now buzzed with an energy it had never seen before. Neighbors whispered amongst themselves, their curiosity piqued by the growing rumors. Everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one, not even Karen, fully understood what was coming. Karen sat at the head of the table, her manicured fingers drumming against the polished wood. She wore her usual mask of authority, but there was an edge to her movements, subtle, but there. She had felt the shift, even if she refused to acknowledge it. James entered calmly, carrying a folder thick with documents. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone turned heads. People who had once ignored him now watched with anticipation. Karen's lips curled in a forced smile. "James, how nice of you to join us." James returned the smile, genuine, but knowing. He took his seat at the front, placing the folder down deliberately. Karen cleared her throat. "Before we begin, I'd like to address some misinformation that's been circulating." She glanced to the crowd, her voice slipping into that patronizing tone she always used when she wanted to reassert control. "There seems to be some confusion regarding the recent landscaping efforts taken by the HOA. I assure you, everything was done within our rights to maintain the aesthetic of our community." James chuckled. "Just loud enough." Karen's gaze snapped to him. "Is something funny?" James leaned back in his chair. "It's just fascinating to hear you talk about rights when you so blatantly violated federal law." The room went still. Karen's mask faltered for just a second, but she recovered. "Federal law?" she scoffed. "Let's not be dramatic." James reached into his folder, pulling out the first document. "This," he said, sliding across the table, "is a detailed report from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It confirms that the trees you had cut down were protected under the Federal Endangered Species Act." Karen's expression barely changed, but the way she gripped the edge of the table gave her away. James pulled out another paper. "This is a cease and desist order from the same agency. It states that any further landscaping efforts without a proper environmental review will result in legal action." Another document. "And this is a formal complaint filed against the HOA, which, if successful, could result in thousands of dollars in fines, not just for the association, but for the individual board members who authorized the destruction." James let the weight of the words settle. Then, he pulled out the final paper. "This," he said, his voice calm but powerful, "is a lawsuit." Karen's carefully maintained composure cracked. "A lawsuit," she repeated, her voice tight. James nodded. "Filed this morning. Against you, personally, as HOA president, for willful destruction of federally protected trees, harassment, and property devaluation." Karen's face drained of color. For the first time, she was speechless. Power shift. The silence in the room was deafening. Karen looked around, expecting the board members to step in, to defend her, to restore the authority she had wielded so effortlessly for years. But no one spoke. Some of them avoided her gaze altogether. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were going to save her. One of the board members, the same one who had nervously held the clipboard during her unannounced visit to James's house, cleared his throat. "Karen, is this true?" Karen bristled. "This is ridiculous. He's twisting the facts." James slid another paper forward. "This is a copy of the penalty schedule. If found guilty, you could be facing personal fines of over $100,000. He let that sink in before adding, "not to mention potential criminal charges for knowingly violating environmental laws." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. James stood. He wasn't smug, wasn't gloating. He didn't need to. "I try to handle this quietly," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "I gave you chances to back down, to make things right. You chose to double down instead." He turned to the rest of the room. "But this isn't just about me. It's about every person here who's been bullied, who's been threatened with fines or forced to comply with arbitrary rules that serve no one but the HOA board." Several heads nodded. A few people even murmured in agreement. James looked back at Karen, who now sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clenched. "Your reign of unchecked power ends today." Then, with quiet finality, he said, "You're done, Karen." The room erupted, not with cheers, not with applause, but with a shift. An undeniable, irreversible shift in power. Karen was no longer in control, and she knew it. The fallout from the HOA meeting was swift and brutal. Karen had built her power on intimidation, manipulation, and carefully curated alliances. But now, under the weight of undeniable evidence and legal action, that foundation crumbled. Within days of the meeting, the HOA board called for an emergency vote. The members, many of whom had once feared Karen, were now eager to distance themselves from her. The verdict was unanimous. Karen was removed as HOA president. But that was only the beginning. The federal lawsuit James had filed gained traction. With the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service involved, the violations weren't just a community dispute anymore. They were a legal disaster. The government fined both the HOA and Karen personally for the destruction of the protected trees. The numbers were staggering. Karen had thought herself untouchable, but now she was looking at six-figure penalties and the possibility of criminal charges. Word spread fast. Neighbors who had once turned a blind eye to her abuses now openly criticized her. The very people she had controlled with fear no longer respected her. The final blow came when her real estate firm, the one she had so proudly flaunted as proof of her authority, cut ties with her. The scandal was too big. No one wanted to be associated with a woman facing federal violations and community outrage. Karen had spent years building herself up as the queen of the neighborhood. Now, she was disgraced, broke, and powerless. Triumphant close. With Karen gone, a new HOA election was held. This time, the board members were chosen by an actual Democratic vote, not through Karen's backdoor dealings. James had no interest in running. He wasn't in this for power. He just wanted justice. But when the votes were tallied, something unexpected happened. The new board invited him to serve as an advisor. They wanted his guidance in making the HOA fair again. They wanted someone who had stood up against corruption and won. James considered it for a long moment, then smiled. "I'll advise," he said, "but only under one condition. No more unchecked power. The HOA should serve the community, not rule it." They agreed. And just like that, the neighborhood began to change. The ridiculous fines and arbitrary rules were reviewed and eliminated. The community started working together instead of being dictated to. For the first time in years, people actually enjoyed living there. And as for James, he finally got to replant his trees. This time, with the full support of his neighbors. Final reflection. One evening, as James stood in his yard looking at the newly planted saplings, Greg walked over with a beer in hand. "Hell of a ride," Greg said, handing James a bottle. James chuckled, taking a sip. "Yeah, didn't expect to turn into a full-time activist over some trees." Greg smirked. "Was never just about the trees, though, was it?" James exhaled, glancing around the neighborhood. For the first time in a long time, it felt right. "No," he admitted. "It wasn't. It was about standing up when no one else would. About proving that bullies only have power if you let them. About showing that integrity, persistence, and a little bit of quiet strength can change everything." Greg clinked his bottle against James's. "To doing what's right," he said. James smiled. "To doing what's right." And with that, the chapter closed, not just on the fight, but on an era of fear in the neighborhood. Justice had been served, and peace had been restored.